So, Locke, here we go. Locke, unlike Hobbes and Machiavelli, is famous across all spheres of philosophy, very influential in all areas of philosophy. Particularly influential and still discussed in great detail today in his theory of personal identity, for example. His major work, he probably would have said, his major philosophical work was his essay concerning human understanding, which is a giant doorstop of a book. Whereas the work that you've read in its entirety. It might have seemed like an awful lot of reading, and probably if you haven't done it yet, it still looms over you. But it's actually a very short work, certainly in contrast to Leviathan. Leviathan is huge, and you only read small excerpts, whereas this is the entire second treatise. But the second treatise, for its length, it punches well above its weight in terms of its of how influential it was. Certainly it was very influential on the framers of the American Constitution, and a lot of the ideas in it will seem very familiar, although at the time they were radical. Certainly different areas of it more radical than others. There is some overlap with Hobbes. Certainly Locke read Hobbes, Locke was familiar with Hobbes, and Locke disagreed with a great deal of what Hobbes had to say. In particular, disagrees with Hobbes's absolutism. So Locke and Hobbes disagree over a number of key issues. One issue, for example, is whether coerced consent can bind. We saw in Hobbes, with his example of a ransom, that he believed that it could. That if you consent to something under great duress, it doesn't matter, it still binds. That's something Locke definitely rejects, as we'll see. They both talk about a state of nature, though their depictions of the state of nature diverge. Famously, of course, Hobbes's state of nature is a horrendous place to be, where life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And his absolutism, where power is concentrated in one absolute sovereign, is a reaction to how terrible the state of nature is, that almost anything is preferable to lapsing into the state of nature. Whereas Locke's depiction of the state of nature, as we shall see, is much more palatable. Now, Hobbesians, of which my dissertation advisor Sharon Lloyd was one, are prone to point out that despite its sort of positive description in Locke, it's certainly true that the state of nature, even Locke's state of nature, can very quickly devolve into a state of war. Whereas for Hobbes, of course, they are coextensive. The state of nature just is a state of war. For Locke, they are distinct states, and you can be in one without being in the other. And this has effects over what kind of political system Locke ends up justifying. The core concepts, or the most important topics discussed in the second discourse, are natural law and natural right. I'm going to go through the second treatise, sort of skimming it, but I'm going to go through the chapters in order and sort of point to where the key ideas emerge. But I want to give you an idea of the overview of the key ideas. So, natural law and natural right. There is this notion that there are such things as natural rights, and there is this thing called the law of nature, which we also saw in Hobbes, but the status of the law of nature was kind of hard to pin down for Hobbes. He seemed to want it always. It didn't seem like it was absolute in the same way that it does in Locke. In Locke, the law of nature can be read by the use of reason by looking at the world, in the same way that we can work out the laws of physics. It's just a fact. The laws of nature are factual, and reason tells us what they are. And they tell us that we have certain rights. in the state of nature. Okay, so the second key concept is this idea of the state of nature. Again, this was an innovation in Hobbes, that we should look at human individuals sort of abstracted from their political setting, and only by doing so can we get an idea of what kind of political setting can be justified. This, of course, is a rejection, explicit rejection of Aristotle's idea that humans are naturally political. So you cannot abstract the human from the political setting, according to Aristotle. That would be like taking an ant out and asking an individual ant, what do you want in your society? The ant doesn't have an existence or goals or plans that are independent of the colony. Whereas humans, as Hobbes and Locke can agree, do. Humans are capable of independent existence. It's not as if it is natural for them to be in a political system. The kind of people who took Aristotle's side in the time that Hobbes and Locke were writing tended to be divine right of kings theorists. And divine right of kings theorists argue that there is this there is this sort of strata of being. You actually get this idea in Shakespeare that there's a great chain of being where God is at the top, but kings are not very far down, and far down below that are the peasants. So anything that upsets the chain of being, say peasants getting above their station and rejecting the dictates of the king, goes against God and nature. Both Hobbes and Locke are overtly Christian. They talk a great deal about Christian teachings. Both of them, however, some readers, some later commentators have argued are not really Christian. There's a very famous Chicago, based at the University of Chicago, political theorist called Leo Strauss, who tended to offer rather, he would be popular amongst conspiracy theorists these days because he tended to offer interpretations of great political works that didn't take them at face value. They looked for sort of hidden meaning in them. And the hidden meaning he found in Locke was that Locke was a sort of secret atheist who gave you clues if you knew how to read them, and really rejected Christ's the teachings of the Bible. I think that view of Locke is fairly soundly rejected now, and people are much more inclined to take Locke's overt theological references seriously. I think Hobbes people are still a little torn about. Certainly there are great areas of Leviathan where he talks about scripture, but again he does seem to have a more skeptical approach to it, whereas Locke, there is a very important role for God in Locke's theory. As we shall see, human beings are the property, literally the property of God, because God created us. And this leads to the fact that you cannot commit suicide, according to Locke. You do not have that right, because that would be to destroy God's property. And you don't have the right to destroy other people's property. Why is it the second treatise of government? Why are we reading the second treatise of government? What happened to the first? Well, the answer is that the first treatise of government is a direct rebuttal of one of these divine rights of kings theorists, Robert Filmer. I believe I called him John Filmer in my previous video, so shame on me. It's Sir Robert Filmer, whose works on the divine right of kings were collected in a volume called Patriarcha. And it's in Patriarcha that he argues that political authority is merely a species of the kind of authority that parents have over their children. So Filmer makes an explicit comparison that they are analogous kinds of power. The power that a parent has over a child is directly analogous, and in fact the latter is derived from it, to the power that a king has over his subjects. So the subjects are like children. And just as your father has absolute power over you, so Filmer's argument went, the king has absolute power over his subjects, and it's natural. That's right. The power that a parent has over their children is just a natural fact. It's God-derived, you might say. And the same thing is true of a king's power over his subjects. That Filmer thinks this explains the great lengths that Locke goes to analyze paternal power, and to show that it is in fact disanalogous to political power. We see that even in the second treatise. Remember, the first treatise he's sort of entirely dedicating to directly attacking Filmer, which is why it's less read today, because people don't take Filmer so seriously anymore. Filmer was taken, this idea of the divine right of kings was taken much more seriously in Locke's time, so he would dedicate an entire work to criticizing it. What we're much more interested in, and what we read today, is his second treatise, where Locke is presenting the positive alternative. If you don't believe that the power and rights of the rulers are derived directly from them being in the eldest line, in a direct line of descent to Adam, which is what Filmer literally argues, and Locke makes a reference to it at the beginning of the second treatise. So Filmer said that Filmer believed that he could trace the lineage of the Stuart kings of England all the way back to the eldest children of Adam, which pretty good going, I would have thought. Pretty good genealogy for the time. And Locke makes a snide comment about that nobody could really do that. Okay, so the state of nature, the point of the state of nature in Locke, as in Hobbes, is a direct rejection of this idea that there are somehow natural ranks that people are born into, and some are born more politically important than others. Hobbes and Locke reject this, and they have what we take to be the modern view, that all humans are born politically equal. In Hobbes, of course, we saw that this equality was taken literally, that they are naturally of similar enough capabilities, both physical and mental, to be counted as equal, descriptively equal. In Locke, this sense of equality is rejected, and the sense of equality that he believes is a much more normative one. So we are politically equal in the state of nature, in that we are equally entitled to the same bundle of rights and powers. So everybody has the same set of rights. Again, very similar to the idea in the Bill of Rights, the American Bill of Rights. Basically, the Bill of Rights, this idea that we have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, comes directly from Locke, except they took out Locke's idea is that we have rights to life, liberty, and property, and they changed that to pursuit of happiness. What even is that? What is the pursuit of happiness? And actually, which leads us to another very important contribution of the second treatise, which is, I think it's the longest chapter in the book, chapter 6, which is on property, of property. And that analysis of property is one of the most complete analyses of the notion of property offered by any political theorist. The only one who probably has more to say and is generally considered more sophisticated is Hegel. But Locke's theory of property is one that actually libertarians to this day find very conducive. They approve of it. And in fact, libertarianism as a political theory has not had many very respectable defenders. Locke is without doubt the most important forebear that libertarians point to. Of contemporary defenders of libertarianism, the most famous in philosophical circles is a guy called Robert Nozick, who was a very bright individual who, like Locke, wrote on just about everything, but had a lot shorter attention span. I know people who knew him. Incredibly bright guy. Wrote one of the best-selling philosophical works of the later half of the 20th century, which is a book called Anarchy, State and Utopia, which was very popular in the 70s, which he sort of dashed off in a few weeks in response to the publication of the great work of John Rawls, Theory of Justice. Nozick read this, didn't like it, and wrote a libertarian tract called Anarchy, State and Utopia, where he sort of takes a lot of his ideas from Locke. And claims Locke as a forebear, as a libertarian. Now, of course, libertarians don't think, well, depending on their degree, some would argue that no form of government is defensible, which is more widely known as anarchism. But others would argue that only a minimal state is justified. And this was Nozick's view, that you need a state to protect the rights that we have. So libertarians all believe that we have natural rights, that we just have rights. This is a self-evident truth, like it says in the Bill of Rights. I think Anarchy, State and Utopia begins with the sentence, people have rights. This is just a fact. Something that, of course, many philosophers would deny, that there even are such things as rights. The great philosopher Jeremy Bentham referred to the idea of rights as nonsense, and the idea of inalienable rights as nonsense on stilts, which is a wonderful phrase. So it's not an uncontroversial notion that we have rights, but libertarians just say, put it out there, we have them, and where do we go from there? And Nozick argued that we need a government to protect our rights, but that's all you need it for. So maybe we need a government to protect borders. Certainly we need a government for courts and to settle disputes. But beyond that, minimal taxation, taxation to the extent that that these courts need financing. Everything else private, like freeways, private, funded by tolls. Schools, private, funded by people who can afford them. Poor people, screwed, essentially. Unless you could persuade someone to take pity on you. But you couldn't. It's unacceptable to demand a welfare state, because that's too much of an intrusion into the property rights of individuals. So that's libertarianism, and there are streaks of that in Locke. Certainly, because Locke's work, because it may not seem so to you, but it is an incredibly short work of a political philosophy. It lays itself open to competing interpretations. And certainly one very popular interpretation of Locke is almost libertarian. Certainly the political system he justifies appears to be a lot more minimal than Hobbes's. And he is outright rejects absolutism. He has several things to say about how absolutism cannot be justified, against what Hobbes, of course, argues. Property, yes, the main thrust, or perhaps the most important message of the second treatise, is that power initially resides in individuals. They can create a political system only by their consent. So political systems can only arise through the consent of those governed. Again, Hobbes says the same thing with some slight differences. So they both have this account of the origin of society in a social contract. They are both social contract theorists, where in a pre-political state, individuals will consent to create a political system. And what is legitimate about the political system can be worked out by looking at what the people in the state of nature are like, what rights and duties they have, and what they would consent to. So that's the same sort of methodology in both. It's just their descriptions of the state of nature are different, and consequently their conclusions about what political systems are justified are different. Locke is very overt that if the government, including kings, breaks essentially the power of a government they have in trust, it is fiduciary. It's a bit like the government under Locke is a bit like an actor's agent. So an actor or an athlete hires an agent and entrusts them to look after their interests. So they give the agent the right to negotiate contracts, for example, for them. So normally that's not something that anyone but you has, the right to negotiate a contract. The athlete or the actor transfers that right to the agent, but of course they can get it back. It's in trust with the agent, but if the agent breaks certain rules, then the trust is broken and the power reverts to the actor or athlete. What are the rules according to which this trust can be broken? Well, that's what Locke wants to specify. That's one of the major points of the second treatise, is specifying when the trust in government is broken, which means that the government is no longer legitimate, the power reverts to society as a whole, and people can overthrow their governments. So effectively, the second treatise is a revolutionary tract. It tells you that the people have the right to overthrow their government. Even the king who claims divine right, can be overthrown by the government, and it sets out the conditions. There is some dispute as to the extent of the conditions, exactly what circumstances. Again, it's a very short work, but there is no doubt that he says that there are circumstances in which, and this is the very last chapter of the second treatise where he goes into this in detail, where the people as a whole can overthrow their government. So revolutionary indeed. Let's have a look at the second treatise. I'm going to go over chapter by chapter. So chapter 1 doesn't have a title. It's very short. It's just 3 sections. It's a summary of the first treatise in section 1. He talks explicitly about Robert Filmer, and summarizes how, well, I blew that guy out of the water, didn't I, in the previous treatise. Section 2, already he makes a distinction that he's going to elaborate on, the distinction of political power from other types. Paternal, and notice he very quickly changes that to parental, because one of the first points he makes is that both the mother and father have it equally, which is an awkward fact for Robert Filmer, because Robert Filmer wants to say the king alone has this power. But of course, your mother has power over you as a child just as much as your father, which makes it very much not the kind of power that is of use to Robert. So paternal, the power a master has over a servant, husband over a wife, lord over slave. Again, it might seem odd for a writer as comparatively late as Locke to be talking about slaves, but as we shall see, he doesn't defend slavery in anything like the same way that either Aristotle does, or, for example, slaveholders in the American, in America at the time would defend slavery. The only way you can become a slave is by forfeit. If you've actually attacked someone in an unjust way and lost to them, then you become their slaves. So it can exist. Slavery does exist, but in very narrow circumstances. All of those other types, though, are to be distinguished from political power, and you cannot derive political power from any of those. He's very insistent on that. So what is political power? In section 3, he gives a definition. It is the right of making laws, so that's the legislative power, for the regulation of property, employing the force of the community, and only for the public good, which, as we shall see, is a very important qualifier that would seem to go against some of the more strictly libertarian interpretations of Locke, because libertarians say it doesn't matter what the public good is, you just protect people's rights, and the public good can never trample on individual rights. The public good is more important than that for Locke. Okay, chapter 2, straight into the discussion of the state of nature. To understand political power, we must understand the natural state of humans. Again, this is the same rejection of Aristotle, that there is a natural state of humans that is apolitical. We are not naturally political beings. So any political structures that exist in the world today are not God decided, are not forced upon us by the nature of humankind, like a pride of lions or something. They are artificial constructs, and we can evaluate them accordingly. We shouldn't regard them as just something we have to accept because that's the way humans are. So the natural state of humans is one of freedom. Now, what does he mean by freedom? He doesn't mean license. In section 6, he very much distinguishes between liberty and license. License is just lawlessness. Liberty, true liberty, according to Locke, is law governed. And the law in the state of nature is, of course, the law of nature. So liberty is to conduct your affairs in a way that is consistent with the laws of nature, at least liberty in the state of nature. But we are naturally free, which means that we're not born under the authority of a king, as Divine Rights of Kings theorists would say. And equality. So liberty and equality. There is no subjugation one to another. We are all politically equal. Section 5, we see the first reference to the judicious hooker, who is a political writer who gives scriptural support for any claim that Locke gives. So you don't need to know about him. He just cites Hooker to give his conclusions weight because they agree with someone who is considered a sort of theological expert. Section 7. Everyone equally has the right to punish transgressors of the state of nature. This view of punishment is, Locke himself admits, an odd one. He calls it he refers to it as his own strange doctrine. So he realizes that there are people who would find his idea that we, in the state of nature, have a right to punish people because there have been writers before Locke, and certainly many since, who say that the right of punishment doesn't make sense outside of a society. It is an entirely socially constructed notion. Locke, on the other hand, will argue one of the cores of the Lockean view is that any powers that government has legitimately can only have been derived from powers given it from people in the state of nature. So if government has the right to punish individuals, as it must, because otherwise, you can't have a government without a punishment system, it must have acquired them from natural rights. So therefore, pretty much working backwards, we must have the right to punish in the state of nature. And he does say, if there's a law of nature, there must be people deputized to punish people who transgress against it, because otherwise what's the point in having a law of nature? And in the state of nature, it must be everyone. Everyone must have this right equally. This right of punishment, this is section 8, allows people in the state of nature to come by a power over another, so long as that person has violated the law. So notice, they're still in a state of nature, but you can establish political disparity in the state of nature. If you violate the law of nature and somebody seeing you violate the law of nature says, hey, and they are enforcing the law of nature, then they have power over you. Another right you have in the state of nature, section 10, the right of reparation. If somebody has done you wrong, you have the right to get, if they've stolen a piece of property of yours, you have a right to get it back, or monetary, or some kind of value equivalent. A magistrate may pardon someone, but may not deny reparation. So now this is going to be once we leave the state of nature, and we're going to set up magistrates, and that's going to be part of being in a political system. Magistrates may say, I'm going to let you off, so they can cede their right to punish, but they cannot cede the right that someone who has been victimized has to reparation. That's not ever given over to a magistrate. The law of nature also sets the degree of punishment in section 12, which is, and issues of deterrence are discussed. Section 13, this is where he calls his own view a strange doctrine. The fact that everyone is... Now, the reason why he admits people will say this is a strange doctrine, because if everybody has the right to punish transgressions, we're going to exhibit favoritism. Everyone's going to say, well, of course you did me wrong. It's like saying both the prosecution and the defense in a criminal case get the right to decide. Well, they're obviously going to disagree. So this is going to be weird right off the bat. But it's true. He says in section 13, it's true that partiality will cause problems, but any system has this problem. I mean, for example, in a monarchy, the monarch's going to take his own side. And that's the worst system of all. If you're a poor peasant and the monarch does you wrong, you know you're screwed and there's nothing you can do about it. Whereas at least in the state of nature, possibly you could do something about it if someone wrongs you. Okay, another objection he considers in section 14, and this is a very important one. He says, where are or ever were they any men in such a state of nature? We saw also in Hobbes that he confronts this criticism, because what Locke is arguing, that governments are set up by people in a pre-political state making this social compact, this agreement amongst themselves. And again, skeptics are going to say, oh, come on, that's ridiculous. The only way that governments arise is by brute force, by someone becoming stronger than somebody else and coercing them to follow them, and then that just becoming custom. Nobody ever freely contracts to make this system. There have been different responses to this. One more contemporary suggestion is to view the social contract as a hypothetical one. That is, it never actually happened. There is no history of societies where you can find in prehistory all these cavemen and women getting together and making an agreement. That didn't actually happen. But this intellectual tool of pretending as if there were a state of nature enables us to still judge whether contemporary political systems are legitimate. So we could say it's just a way to judge political systems. Could it have been the case that people could have agreed to such a system? Or would they have to be irrational to agree to such a system? We're not saying they actually did, but could they have? That is the hypothetical contract response. And the first person to absolutely explicitly do that is Immanuel Kant. There have been interpretations of earlier contract theorists like Locke, like Hobbes, that read them as giving hypothetical contract accounts. But that's not the response that Locke gives here. He actually says, I'm going to, instead of saying, it's not a real idea, I'm not saying people actually did this. He says, yes, they really exist. And what's more, there are people still to this day in a state of nature. Because a state of nature is where there is no common judge to decide amongst people. And of course, this can happen amongst two rulers. Assume there's no United Nations. The King of England and the King of France are in the state of nature with respect to each other because there is no one above them deputized to settle disputes. That's the true measure of being in the state of nature, where there is no judge, there is no common judge. And he says, he also gives the example of a Swiss and an Indian in the woods of America, and they're in the state of nature. Okay, then we move on to chapter 3 of the state of war. Again, a key difference between Locke and Hobbes is that these are not coextensive. Coextensive means covering all the same circumstances. An example of two coextensive terms are renate and caudate. I take this from the philosopher Quine. Renate means having kidneys, doesn't it? Yeah, I think it's kidneys, not liver. Renate means having kidneys, and caudate means having a heart. Now, they mean two different things, but they're coextensive in that every creature that is renate, that has kidneys, also has a heart, and vice versa. So coextensive means covering the same circumstances. So although Hobbes can define state of nature and state of war in different terms, he says they're coextensive. Anything that is a state of nature is also a state of war. For Locke, they are not coextensive. You can have a state of nature without a state of war, and vice versa. So that's why they're, of course, different chapters. All right, so what is the state of war for Locke? A state of war is entered between two individuals when one declares a sedate, settled design on another man's life. This is section 16. This can be done without actually threatening death. Even, if somebody tries to steal something off you on the road, even if they only intend to steal a button off your coat, that can be interpreted as a declaration of a state of war, because without a common judge, who knows if this person will just kill you, because who's to stop them? So consequently, it looks like what a Hobbesian would say is, that's basically what I said. That means that everything is a state of war because anything could be a threat when there's no common judge. So therefore the state of nature is the state of war. Which of course, and it's very important for Locke though that they be distinct, because he wants to say that return to a state of nature is not such a huge calamity. So therefore people do have much more grounds for overthrowing unjust governments than under Hobbes. Hobbes says even a tyranny has got to be better than the state of nature because it is a constant state of war, which is why Hobbes ends up justifying absolutism. Whereas Locke doesn't want to justify absolutism and in fact rejects it. So he's going to say, no, the state of nature could be good. It's in which case, well, if the state of nature is so good, why ever set up a government? Well, because it could collapse easily into the state of war. At which point a Hobbesian says, yeah, because they're one and the same, like I said. But Locke wants to keep them apart. He who attempts to get another man into his absolute power does thereby put himself into a state of war. Later on, he describes the state of war as force without right. Whenever someone applies force without right on another person, they're in a state of war. The explicit distinction between the two states is section 19. Men living together according to reason without a common superior on earth, that's the key element. If you don't have a common superior, because we're all naturally equal and we haven't set one up, with authority to judge between them, that makes you in the state of nature, which is why two kings are in the state of nature. They're equal and nobody to judge them. Contrast that with a state of war. Force or a declared design of force upon the person of another where there is no common superior on earth to appeal to for relief. You're in the former simply if there's no common judge. You're only in the latter if someone attempts force without right. Now, of course, why not stay in the state of nature? Anarchists would say, yeah, stay in the state of nature. It's got to be better than any system where people are bossing you around. But Locke thinks that being in the state of nature there's a limit to how far we can progress. The problem with the state of nature, as he says in section 20, is that without a judge to settle disputes, states of war tend to be prolonged. How do you end a state of war? Once you get into one, it keeps going. Like the feud between the Hatfields and the McCoys. That just went on, a famous feud. Look it up if you're not familiar with it. Or if you've read Huckleberry Finn. One of the first things that happens to Huck when he goes on his journeys is he encounters these two rival families that have been killing each other for years. And they're based on the Hatfield and the McCoys. It just never ends. The dispute festers and festers. And also you have the right, he gives people the right to kill themselves in self-defense even when they think they're being threatened. Locke is very stand your ground-ish. In section 21 we get our first mention of this notion, which he will talk a lot about at various places in the book, an appeal to heaven. An appeal to heaven essentially means fight it out and whoever wins is God's favorite. So if a dispute is settled by an appeal to heaven in Locke, that means you fight it out. Kill them all and let God decide, as the Simpsons would say. And of course, he actually brings this up again in the last chapter, where the people can have an appeal to heaven against the government, so they can actually go to war with their government. Chapter 4 of slavery. There's natural liberty. In this section 22, he defines natural liberty for man to be free from any superior power on earth, not to be under the will or legitimate authority of man, but only the law of nature for his rule. So no positive laws. Positive laws are laws created by humans, only natural law. Now, does that mean that man in society is not free? Because, of course, they don't have natural liberty. No, there's a different kind of liberty in society. The liberty in society is to be under no legislative power, but that established by consent. So you are not free if you are under a political system where you didn't consent to it. So if it's a monarchy, it's somebody who claims to be a hereditary monarch who is naturally superior to you by on Filmarian grounds, then you don't have this kind of freedom. So it is possible to be free in society. It's different, of course, from the freedom in the state of nature, but it's also possible not to be free. And the way to preserve freedom is to be under a system that was established by consent. So Locke is a consent theorist of legitimate government, and we'll get into that in a bit. It is impossible voluntarily to enslave oneself. That is, one can't just go to somebody else and say, I will be your slave. So Locke, not big on BDSM. Nobody, section 23, nobody can give more power than he has himself, and he that cannot take away his own life. Remember I said we're God's property, so we can't commit suicide. So I don't have control over my own life. I cannot give it to anyone else. So you can't enslave them. Section 24, you can have slavery, but only by forfeit. That is where you attack someone and instead of killing you in self-defense, as they have the right to, they capture you. So because they did have the right to kill you, because of this self-defense right, then they have the right of your life. So you are a slave to them by forfeit. That can happen. But you had to be in the wrong first. Chapter 5. Is it chapter 5? I thought it was chapter 6. Yes, chapter 5. Chapter 5 of property. As I said, very long chapter. much discussed. Let me give you the high points. How do we acquire property? Well, notice in Hobbes is explicit about this. There is no property in the state of nature. There is possession. So I can grab something and I can say, this is mine. Well, I possess it, but is it mine in the sense that we normally understand, in that I have a right to it? Hobbes says, no, you don't have rights in the state of nature. You have what you can defend. So if you're big, then you can keep, if you can keep hold of it, it's still in your possession. But there's no such thing as it being rightfully mine. If somebody grabs it off me, I can say, hey, give it back, that's mine. And those are just words for Hobbes. So the only time we get a system of property for Hobbes is when we're in society, when there's political power to back up this system of property rights. Now, what system of property rights? That's up to the sovereign. So the sovereign, now Hobbes does say that the good of the people must be respected. So certainly a lot of people have said that Hobbes would be in favor of an extensive welfare state or something like that. So Hobbes is not someone who says the king gets to do what he wants, but he does say that the sovereign gets to decide the system of property, including who owns what, and including degrees of taxation. They just haven't got to be too arduous. Absolutely not the case for Locke. You can come to rightfully own something in the state of nature, because the laws of nature are laws that govern the state of nature, and the laws of nature, we can work out that the laws of nature must allow property. Now, how do we do this? Well, and Locke does start from one major barrier to this idea of private property in the state of nature. And the major barrier is that it is generally understood that God gave the world to humankind in common. He didn't give the world to you, and the other people have to go to you if they want to use any of it. So no, it's given to all humans in common. So there is no private property direct from God. Every property is public. Given that, how is it possible to chop off bits of the public property and make them privately mine? It would be like me going to Yellowstone and saying, I'm gonna set up a little yard in Yellowstone and it's going to be my private property. You can't do that because it's a public, it belongs to the people of America. You can't do that. So Locke is saying there has to be some way to go from the public property to the private. How can we justify this? Well, he says in section 26, he says there must be one, because otherwise, why did God give the earth to man in common? To survive. He said, and he's referring to what it says in the Bible, in Genesis, I assume. Here is the world to use to keep you alive. Well, we'd all starve if you couldn't eat anything. And what is eating something? But clearly you have private property of what you eat. Now, you might say that, well, that's a bit of a dubious leap, but I'm just telling you what it says. So there must be a way for individuals to appropriate private property, because otherwise God's goal in leaving the earth to us wouldn't be realized. You can't be nourished by a fruit without eating it. Okay, so how do you acquire private property? Section 27. You have self-ownership. Now, you might say, well, wait a minute, I thought we were God's property. Yeah, and this is a point of contention amongst Locke scholars. Do we own ourselves, or does God own us? Well, God created us, but he created us to take care of our earthly affairs. Now, we're not allowed to kill ourselves, because that would be to destroy God's property, but we can do other things with ourselves. So I guess maybe think of it as like an apartment. God is the apartment block owner, but you can decorate your own apartment. It's your own apartment. You can say it's my apartment. You get to throw people out of it because it's your apartment. But really, God owns the apartment block. Maybe that's the way to think of it. But it does say we have ownership of ourselves. Every man has a property in his own person. This nobody has any right to but himself. This is in section 27. From this follows the fact that you own your labor. The labor of his body and the work of his hands, we may say, are properly his. And once you own your labor, you can own what you produce with it. And this is kind of an odd notion. He says, whatsoever he, the average person, removes out of the state that nature have provided, which is the general common property that God gave to us, and left it in, he hath mixed his labor with, and joined to it something that is his own, and thereby makes it his property. So this is the mixing your labor theory of property. Why is that statue that I made out of clay mine? Because whereas the clay belonged to the world in common before. So how is that statue mine? Because I mixed my labor with the clay and transformed it into something that was imbued with my property and therefore mine. Now Nozick, again, he's a fan of Locke, but he saw the problem with this. He says, well, wait a minute. Suppose I own a can of tomato juice and I mix it with the sea. I've just lost my can. I haven't gained the sea. So how does this mixing work? Well, you tell me. I mean, different people suggest different things. But many people have found this a plausible account because they want to... what other account of private property in a state of nature can you give? Interestingly, there are limits. And this is where the libertarian runs into problems. Or maybe they do. Because in this section 27, there is a famous proviso, a restriction. This labor being the unquestionable property of the laborer, no man but he can have a right to what is once joined to, at least where there is enough and as good left in common for others. What does that mean? On the one hand, you might say, well, if I've removed some, then there isn't the same amount. And he would say, no, I just said enough and as good. Now, obviously, in the first ages of the world, there's a world and very few people. So my removing a few acres of land leaves plenty for everybody else. But what about in society? What about it? As soon as you get scarce resources, it looks like there isn't enough and as good left over. What are you going to do then? Good question, and Locke has some answer to that later. There is another limit to property. So there's this one, the enough and as good proviso. The second limit is in section 31, where he says, there is a limit to how much you can acquire because of spoilage. As much as anyone can make use of to any advantage of his life before it spoils, so much he may by his labor fix a property in. Whatever is beyond this is more than his share and belongs to others. Nothing was made by God for man to spoil or destroy. So in other words, you can't, in the state of nature, find an orchard of apples and think, ooh, I can gain power over people if I pick all the apples and stockpile them, and then they're going to have to come to me and I can get something out of them for my apples. No, that's more than your share, because you can't eat all of those. You're only entitled to what you can use. Sounds great. Sounds kind of anarchistic and communist. Well, until money is invented, and we'll see that money is a way around this proviso. Section 34, God gave the world to the use of the industrious and the rational. There's some parts of this chapter that commentators have read as justification for stealing America from Native Americans. And there's a lot to read in that. Locke was engaged in writing the Constitution of the Carolinas during the same period. Scholars have suggested that he's writing the second treatise. So it looks like some of the things he says might be justification for land stealing, because there's a lot of talk about America and how, you know, if you cultivate land, it makes it much more valuable, and that, you know, God wants you to cultivate it, and if you leave it fallow, it's practically worthless. So God couldn't object to me taking it so long as I cultivated it. And so, in other words, people could say, well, the Native Americans weren't using it, so we haven't stolen it because we put value in it that was not in it before. Very dubious, and certainly the kind of argument that is still used by right-wing commentators to this day to say why it wasn't a bad thing for white settlers to take away lands that were being used by natives. Section 37. Section 36 is that. So this idea that you add value by imbuing it with your labor kind of undoes the enough and as good proviso, because in effect, if you take land and then you cultivate it, you have made more value than there was before, because cultivated land is worth so much more than uncultivated land. So you have given the world in general more value. So of course you leave enough and as good. So this suggests, again, you can take land from natives who let it lie fallow. Section 37 undoes the spoilage proviso. It's the introduction of money, because money doesn't spoil. So what I can do is I can then get all the apples from the orchard, stockpile them, and then sell them before they rot. Nothing spoils, everybody gets the apple they want, and I become rich. And I'm stockpiling the gold now, but that doesn't spoil, so no harm done. So you can become wealthy in the state of nature. Now, notice what the effect of this is going to be. People in the state of nature are going to be economically unequal at the point at which they make the social contract. That suggests that there could be some rigging of the system in favor of the rich. And in fact, as we shall see when we get to Rousseau next time, this is Rousseau's major complaint against Locke in his Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, that Locke's very idea is a trick by the rich. So in other words, what Locke is going to justify is a political system that protects property rights. Who's that in favor of? People who've gotten rich in the state of nature, because they've got rights that are worth something. I mean, if you've got nothing, your property rights are next to useless. You know, you've got nothing of value. Whereas if you've amassed great wealth and suddenly in a state of nature you're in danger because everybody wants your wealth, it's obviously in your interest to set up a political system where the entire justice system is on your side and will protect your wealth. That's the discussion of money. Section 40 is the labor theory of value. And there's much more talk of this. Labor has natural value, but money only has artificial value. Section 50, by the tacit consent of humans. This is the first mention of the notion of tacit consent, which has a much more important role later on. But he does mention it in section 50, that money has value by the tacit consent of humans outside of society. So there can be money and property outside of political society. Wow, this state of nature is pretty amazing. Most political writers, before and since, would deny that. They would say that both money and property are inherently social phenomena, that they can only exist after we have set up a political system. For Locke, they can exist prior, and that therefore part of the point of the political system is to protect the things that you already have. Chapter 6 of Paternal Power. Now, as I've already mentioned, this is largely an attack on Filmer, who argued that paternal power was the root of political power. So everything in this chapter should be read with that in mind. And actually, he sounds very forward-thinking in that he says, not only, of course, is paternal power and political power distinct, you can't derive one from another, but it wouldn't even be in Filmer's interest to do so, because let's look carefully about what paternal power is. First of all, it's really parental power, so it's held equally by both parents. Secondly, it's not really a power. You can't kill your children. So if you're going to say the king can kill his subjects because he's like a father, what kind of father is that? No father is allowed to kill their children. In fact, he says, parental power is not a power at all. It's a duty. So what we call parental power is actually a duty that parents have to look after their children. And I guess it would be fine if you derive political power from that, but it would be a very benign form of political power. He does say that there are a couple of rights that parents have, that they can punish their children, but not exorbitantly, and that's only derivative from their duty to care for them. You know, sometimes you need to punish your kids so they won't do that stupid thing again. You know, you're not doing it because you have a right to do it and you get kicks from it. That's not what God wants from a parent. It's that this is your only way to ensure that the child develops in a correct way and is safe. In this chapter is the very important discussion in this is whether or not one can be born free. Because remember, he says in the state of nature, we are born free. Well, how can you be born free if you're born under the power of your parents? You're never free. I mean, ask a kid if they're free to do what they want. Of course they aren't. So in what sense are we born free? Well, he says we're not free. They are, let's see. Section 54. Natural equality means that equal right that every man hath to his natural freedom, without being subjected to the will or authority of any other man. Children, in section 55, children are not born in equality, but to it. That is, they are under the subjection of their parents, but it is temporary. And at the age of reason, they come into the birthright of freedom. Parents have the duty to look after their children, which is God's workmanship. Now, children are not free in this sense because freedom is law-governed behavior. This is section 57. And to be able to govern one's behavior under laws, one has to understand them, which children do not. You need reason to understand the law of nature. Where there is no law, because you don't understand the law of nature, there is no freedom. This is, again, the distinction between liberty, which is law-governed, and license, which is lack of restrictions. Lunatics and idiots, he says in section 60, are never free because they will never understand the law of nature. Children are temporarily unfree. Section 61, summary. We are born free as we are born rational. Not that we actually have the exercise of either. You're not yet rational when you're a child. You're not yet free when you're a child. But you're born into that, in that you will one day have them. Age that brings one brings with it the other too, brings rationality and therefore freedom. When do you become free? When you reach the age of reason, which is 18 usually. Why are you free then? Because you can understand the law of nature and you're capable of law-governed behavior. And thus we see how natural freedom and subjection to parents may consist together. Because that's usually an argument against views like his, that we're naturally free and equal. You say you're born into freedom, kids are not free, so why should we ever be free? And if the king is like a parent that lasts forever, then you never free yourself from this obligation. And this chapter is Locke's response. He also, in this chapter, there's a section where he explains the preponderance of monarchies. Again, he's responding to someone like Filmer, who can say, come on, my theory, it says that monarchies are natural, and that just fits with the historical record. There's so many, most governments throughout history. I mean, Athens is like a shining counterexample of a democracy. Practically every other political system that we've ever had, someone like Filmer could say, was a monarchy. How does that fit with your natural freedom theory? So he has to give an account, and he does so in section 73 in particular, how people from a state of freedom might sort of slip into regarding the parent of the clan as like a ruler, and then so this might evolve without it being natural or God-given. So Locke is trying to give an explanation of how we might come to have things that look like monarchies without them being divinely required or anything like that. All right. So, but he says, but this doesn't mean that fathers really were kings by right any more than they were priests by right, he says in the last section of this, 76. And Locke points out the father's just as likely to act as the priest for the family, but we don't think that God inspires every father to be the priest for the family. Same analogy for ruler. It's just something that they fall into the habit of doing, but it doesn't mean that it's divinely inspired. Chapter 7 of Political or Civil Society. Here it says that the family is the first society. He doesn't mean literally political society, he just means social unit. This is where he speculates on biological things, and it's interesting that he compares us to other animals in a way that sounds almost Darwinian. And he says that in humans, we stay together more than herd animals. Herd animals, the mother can care for herself by just eating the cud. Prey animals, they stay together longer because the mother can't hunt while she's caring for the babies. So they would die out if nature had not determined that the father sticks around and helps out. And humans are like that. Now there's a kind of contract, but it's not a real contract. Section 85, he talks about slaves, captives taken into a just war. Section 87, property is defined as life, liberty, and estate. And in section 87, we see civil society requires giving up the natural right to punishment. So remember his strange doctrine that we naturally have this right. To enter civil society, we have to give it up. Because this is section 87. Because no political society can be nor subsist without having in itself the power to preserve the property and punish the offences of all those that live in society. There and there only is political society where every one of the members have quitted this natural power, resigned it up into the hands of the community. So we naturally have a right to punish, but of course this leads to the risk of the state of war. So to avoid that, we give it up to the community. The community has it as a whole, and then nobody can automatically decide in their own affairs. The two powers of government are the power of making laws and the power of war and peace. First one is the legislative, and it's more important. And the second one appears to be a sort of combination of executive and federative, what he calls. Those are the powers that government has. And those powers the government only has because they draw them from the natural powers that people have in the state of nature that they pool. So it's almost like everybody in the state of nature has a little glass of water that is their own powers. And then the power of the government is this giant pool of water, but it only comes from everybody pouring their individual little glasses in. And that creates the power of the government. But it derives directly from powers that had to exist in the state of nature. No power comes ex nihilo and out of nothing. It only comes from powers that people in the state of nature already had, according to Locke. Section 89, two ways of joining society by consent. Yes, he's a consent theorist. So he has this theory, social contract theory. The founding of society has to be consent. No society springs into being except by the founding contract. So that's one kind of consent, where people are all gathered together in the state of nature and says, I don't like that we keep fighting, and when we get into a state of war, there's no one to stop it. Do you want to set up a system to avoid this inconvenience? Everyone said, yeah, good idea. So they say, okay, let's make an agreement, and in this agreement, give up our private rights to the common lot. That's the social contract. That's what you might call founding consent. But there's another form of consent that happens ever after. For example, you and I gave consent to our government when we joined it. Now, this wasn't at birth, because remember, children are not members of any society until they reach the age of reason, because they don't understand laws, they don't have reason to understand laws, and therefore cannot be held to any contract. It's like if a little kid in the old days gets online and uses the parent's credit card and buys a ton of stuff, that doesn't count. And it's the parent can say that was a mistake, my kid did it, and the people they gave the money to have to give it back, because the kid cannot contract, because they're not of the age of reason. So children are in the state of nature until the age of reason. And in fact, they're still in the state of nature once they reach the age of reason. There's the example, I can't remember where it is, but he says this must be the case because otherwise the child of two English people two English people go on holiday to France, have a child in France. Of where is that child a citizen? Not England or France. They get to choose. And in fact, he says that's really what happens with every child. Every child is not a citizen of anywhere. They only become a citizen when they make express choice. So all political legitimacy, the power that the government and laws has over me, is only legitimate insofar as it derives from my own consent. That's why Locke is a consent theorist. So that second kind is joining consent. When anyone joins himself to or incorporates with any government already made. This is in section 89. Sections 90 to 94 are his critique of absolutism. So read this as anti-Hobbes. Absolute monarchy cannot be a civil society because the end of civil society is to avoid the inconveniences of having no independent arbiter. So why would anyone agree to a situation where the king is above the law? In fact, you're worse off in an absolutist state than you are in a state of nature. Directly the opposite of what Hobbes says. Because, as he says, agreeing to an absolutist state would be like escaping from polecats or from foxes only to be devoured by a lion. This is in section 93. Because in a state of nature, you've just got individuals against you. In an absolutist monarchy, you've got the king and all of the forces he can marshal against you, which is much worse. So absolutist monarchy is not something that anyone would consent to. So that's his argument against a Hobbesian system. Chapter 8 of the Beginning of Political Society. This is section 97 is his description of the social contract happening. And thus every man, by consenting with others to make one body politic under one government, puts himself under an obligation to every one of that society. So you're consenting with each other again, just like in Hobbes. You're not consenting with the monarch, you're consenting with everyone else. To submit to the determination of the majority. So yes, here's an important point. The founding of a society, the founding of a political system takes two stages. Number one, this stage is the making of a society. Naturally, we are all individuals. There is no such thing as society. But we make a society by consenting to form it. That, as it stands, is automatic majority rule. As he says, section 98, why majority rule must be assumed. Otherwise, no society will last any time at all. So we're setting up a group. We're giving all our private rights to the group. It's like a club. It doesn't have a set political system. You don't directly consent. Let's set up a monarchy. No, you set up, you become a unit. You make the Leviathan. Remember the picture on the cover of Hobbes's work, or on the frontispiece, where the society is composed of all the little people. That's what you do. That's stage one. That's a civil society. And then the next stage is, you have created a giant person that has a will. What is the will of this group of people that it acts as one? It must be the majority will. That's the only decision procedure that makes sense. So that's what he's saying in section 98. There must be majority rule. So the will of the Leviathan is majority rule. So then you can either stay like that, in which case you'd have a kind of commune, which is direct democracy, something like Athens maybe. You can stay like that, or you can create representatives. You can the society gives its power of the power of the society is put in trust into representatives. That's when you set up a political system other than direct democracy, as most are. But it's fiduciary power. That means, like the agent that I was talking about earlier, it's in trust to the government. That's stage 2. Now, there are 2 criticisms of the strict consent standard, that only consent can start a lawful society. The 2 criticisms are mentioned in section 100. The first one is there's no historical record of founding of a society. He answers this in sections 101 to 112. The second criticism is all men are born under government and are not at liberty to begin a new one. So this could never happen. This is an Aristotelian point, that we're naturally born in society. He responds to this in sections 113 to 118. And he says one obvious example is people who break away to form new societies. Don't want to spend too much time, so I'm going to skip over those. You can read those. Section 119 is a very important one. It's where he distinguishes between tacit and express consent, because it's an obvious flaw with his argument. He says you can only be legitimately obligated to obey the laws of your society. Like, why do I have to obey the laws? His answer is, because you consented. If you didn't consent, you don't have to. Wow. Then it looks like, the obvious criticism is, most people never consented, so great, I don't have to obey, I'm not bound by the laws. That's a relief. He wants to say, no. Now, actually, some interpreters of Locke, again the libertarian ones, take this literally. They say, yes, it is a strict consent standard, and yes, most people haven't consented. So yes, most applications of laws are illegitimate. You know, that's the anarchist view. That's A. John Simmons is a famous contemporary defender of what he calls philosophical anarchism, and he takes this view. But Locke appears to he wants to say, no, actually you did give consent. Oh, I don't remember doing it. Yeah, well, you did. So how did I do it? I don't remember. I mean, it obviously happens in the case of people like me. I became a citizen January of last year, 2019, and I actually had to swear to obey the laws. So I consented. Locke can point to that. But of course, most people don't do that. No native-born person ever does that. There's no ceremony. So when did their consent happen? He says, well, one way you can do it is by inheriting property. Because if you, particularly land, if you take on land, you are agreeing to the terms it comes with. And of course, no government is going to allow foreign powers to suck up land, because then someone like China could buy up, a small country piece by piece, and suddenly it would be part of China. No, if you buy land or acquire land, it comes with obligations to the country in whose borders it falls. And so if you inherit land from your parents, that counts as consent to obey the laws. And also he talks about tacit consent. So section 119. Every man that hath any possessions or enjoyment of any part of the dominion of any government doth thereby give his tacit consent, and is far forth obliged to obedience to the laws of the government. Now, but notice he makes an explicit distinction. If you are visiting France, you have to obey the French laws. Why? Because by walking on French land, you give tacit consent. Does that mean you're a citizen of France? No, just means while you're there. Well, does that mean that people who are born in America are just giving tacit consent, and if they left America, they would no longer have to obey its laws? They couldn't be called back in extradition treaties or something like that? No. So it must be So he does say literally that tacit consent is only consent to obey the laws while you're there. But if you give express consent, you've joined, you're stuck with it. Submitting to the laws of any country, living quietly and enjoying privileges and protections under them, tacit consent, makes not a man a member of that society. Nothing can make any man so, but his actually entering into it by positive engagement. That's section 122. So critics of Locke have attacked this notion of tacit, how far it works when you give it, whether or not the only consent we ever give is tacit and we don't give express. So there's a great literature about political obligation. Chapter 9 of the Ends of Political Society. Why would one leave the freedom of the state of nature? Well, because the state of nature has three problems, section 124. 124 and forward. The chief end of uniting into a commonwealth is preservation of property, because the state of nature lacks three features: settled known law, a known and indifferent, which means unbiased, judge, power to back up judicial decisions. It is lack of those three things in the state of nature that makes people give up their right to punish and enter civil society. Two powers each person has in the state of nature. Recap of what we said in sections 6 and 7. To do whatever he thinks fit for the preservation of himself, within the permission of the law of nature, which allows the sort of stand your ground self-defense. And two, to punish transgressions of that law. You give up both of them on joining society. You give up the first one partially to the extent needed to ensure that everybody has equal society, but you still preserve some of that. You give up your right to punish transgressions totally. This is in sections 129 and 130. Giving them up is rational, sensible. It is only being with an intention in everyone the better to preserve himself, his liberty and property, for no rational creature can be supposed to change his condition with an intention to be worse. The power of society or legislative constituted by them can never be exposed to extend farther than the common good. This passage is very controversial. It has led to the hypothetical contract interpretations of Locke. That suggests you don't actually need to consent, and the social contract is just a standard. So in other words, is a political society legitimate? It doesn't depend on whether you actually gave consent. The standard is, would people have been rational to consent to us? And there's a lot to back this up. For example, Locke seems to be suggesting that what's wrong with absolutist systems is that you would be irrational to give it up. But of course, if it was a strict consent standard, as Locke elsewhere says, then people could consent to absolutist monarchy. They'd be stupid to, but people are stupid. It's like, you were stupid to buy that jacket. It makes you look ridiculous. But you still own it, and you can't take it back to the store and says, I was stupid, so therefore I don't own it. No, consent can bind you even if you're stupid to give it, so long as it's not coerced. And that, of course, Locke disagrees with Hobbes. So the strict consent standard doesn't care about whether or not you're rational. So why is Locke talking about rationality? Interpreters of Locke have taken this to say, oh, that's the real point of this social contract. It's just, he's just saying we imagine people agreeing, and if they would be rational to agree to it, then it's legitimate. They didn't actually have to agree to it. But that doesn't fit with other parts of Locke. He definitely, with the previous chapter where he's talked about express consent. So there are these competing traditions in Locke scholarships. The one says hypothetical contract, and this is a major passage backing that up, and the other says express consent. The point of giving up these powers is to preserve property. The ends of civil government must be no other but the peace, safety, and public good of the people, requiring laws, an impartial judge, and executive power to make up for the lack of those in a state of nature. Chapter 10 is ridiculously short. Think of all the discussion in Machiavellian Hobbes and Aristotle of the various forms of government. All the time they spent talking about the difference between aristocracy and democracy, and some said there were three systems. Hobbes says there are three. and the bad three are just said by people who don't like the three, whereas Machiavelli and Aristotle says there are six. There's monarchy and tyranny, and aristocracy and oligarchy, and democracy and anarchy, you know. Locke dismisses them in two sections. He's just not interested in that. He says, so this is important. Locke is open to a wide variety of different political systems. So he doesn't take his standards to require one system over another. Hobbes, of course, is the same. People tend to assume that Hobbes argues for an absolute monarchy because he does say that a monarchy is probably more advisable. But he allows that you can have an absolutist aristocracy, you can have an absolutist democracy even. It's just that they might not be quite as super stable as a monarchy, and there are these various practical issues with them. But he says monarchies have problems too, like if the king dies without leaving an heir, that's a real problem. So both Hobbes and Locke, neither Hobbes nor Locke is saying that, you know, you gotta have a democracy or you've got to have this. What they do say is Hobbes say you've got to have all the powers combined in the sovereign. You cannot have divided sovereignty for Hobbes. That's very important because it undermines stability. Locke, on the other hand, says you've got to have divided government. And one of the main reasons for that is, as we shall see, the executive must stay always in effect, but the legislature shouldn't always stay in effect. So you can't have them combined in one, and they are distinct powers. But you can have the executive have some legislative powers too, and in fact that was the case during Locke's lifetime, where you had the king, you had the House of Commons, which is like the Congress in America, and the House of Lords, which is like the Senate. And all three of them shared legislative powers, but only the king had executive power. So I'm going to skip over that, but the supreme power is the legislative. That's important. Of the extent of the legislative power, chapter 11. Although the legislative is the supreme power, it cannot be arbitrary, that is, subject to no constraints. He's very insistent on this, section 135. Because then it would exceed the individual powers that compose it, and it cannot be greater than the sum of its parts. So section 135, a man cannot subject himself to the arbitrary power of another, and having in the state of nature no arbitrary power over the life, liberty, or possessions of another, this is all he doth or can give up to the commonwealth, and by it the legislative power. Again, the glasses of water theory. The only power that a political system has derives directly from powers that the individuals had in the state of nature. You don't have arbitrary power over another in the state of nature, so the political system can't have arbitrary power. Cannot be extemporaneous, but must operate by known authorized judges interpreting settled standing laws. 136. Note 138. The supreme power cannot take from any man any part of his property without his own consent. Libertarians love this part. For the preservation of property being the end of government. Does this mean you can't have taxation? No, there's got to be taxation, but it must be what you consented to. Claim to have property at all, it must be the case that nobody can take it. Again, a libertarian loves this. This is section 138. Me, therefore, in society having property, men therefore in society having property, they have such rights to the goods which by the law of the community are theirs, that nobody hath a right to take their substance or any part of it from them without their consent. It's not an argument against all taxation, because just against individuals in power enriching themselves at the expense of the people. There's a distinction between absolute and arbitrary power, 139. Example of the military. Officers have absolute power. They can command them to lay down their lives, but not arbitrary. They can't take their property. So even when somebody has power of life or death over you, they don't have rights to your property. Summary of all this in section 142. That's nice. I'm going faster now because, I realize at this point there's a limit to how long people will listen to me talk. And we've probably exceeded it. Chapter 12 of the legislative, executive, and federative power. A federative power in 146 is the power of war and peace, leagues and alliances, basically international affairs. Constraints of the makeup of the legislature, 143. Not permanently in session, but the executive is always in session, 144. Lacking executive power, so the legislative, so separation of powers. But still the legislative is above executive. Legislative makes laws, executive interprets the laws. He doesn't talk about a judiciary, so in that sense, we're used to the separation of powers in the United States, the three branches. He doesn't talk about a judiciary. He seems to think that interpretation of the laws, which is the job of the judiciary in the States, is sort of shared amongst the executive and the legislative. And in fact, the discussion of prerogative requires interpretation. We'll get to that in a little bit. Chapter 13 of the subordination of the powers of the Commonwealth, section 149. The legislature only has fiduciary power. Remember, this is like the agent has the power an agent has to make contracts for you is put in trust with you. That's what fiduciary power. If the terms of the trust are broken, the power devolves back to the people, 149. And thus the community perpetually retains a supreme power of saving themselves from the attempts and designs of any body, even of their legislatures, whenever they be so foolish or so wicked as to lay and carry out designs against the liberties and properties of the subject. This is the basis for rebellion. While the government exists, the legislative has power, and it is supreme over executive and federative. Trump, who regards himself as a king, wouldn't like this. When legislative and executive powers are held by a single body or an individual, notice, although, how is it that he's insistent on separation of powers, but they can be held by one person? Well, because there's a difference between the powers, which are separate, and institutions. So institutions, like the monarch or the parliament, can share in the powers, but the powers themselves are distinct. That person is supreme, but only as long as he follows the end of the legislative. If he ceases to represent the good of the people as a whole, this is in section 151, quote, he degrades himself and is but a single private person without power. Constant frequent meetings of the legislative and long continuations of their assemblies without necessary occasion could not but be burdensome to the people. This is section 156. This is something that, as we shall see, Rousseau very vehemently rejects. He argues that if you are not meeting constantly, you have given up yourself into slavery, in effect. But Locke has a more pragmatic view. Chapter 14 of Prerogative, the Bobby Brown section. The executive has the right to interpret the law so long as it is clearly towards the preservation of society. So prerogative is where you say, does the law include this? This appears to go against the law, but, this is a case where breaking the law is clearly in the public good. And the example he gives of pulling down an innocent man's house to stop a fire, like eminent domain or something like this. The executive can and also the power of pardon. So strictly speaking, by the law, certain people should be guilty. The executive can pardon them. What explains his prerogative? He is doing where he sees that following the letter of the law would not further the public good. So he's allowed to bend the law, the scope of the law, so long as, and only so long as, it's in the public good. Now, when you have a good ruler, people trust them that whatever they do will be in the public good. So they tend to have a much larger sphere of prerogative, that people will let them get away with anything because they trust them. And that's why he says good rulers are dangerous to the liberty of individuals. Yes, section 166. The reigns of good princes have always been most dangerous to the liberties of the people, because they set a standard for a wide scope of prerogative that then bad princes come in and say, ooh, I'm going to do that. It's like we're discovering that the president, strictly speaking, a president can do all kinds of things and it's not against the law. It's just we never had a law against it because we had better presidents who didn't try that shit. And then in comes Trump and says, oh, can I get away with this? There's no law against it. Oh, I'm going to do it. I'm going to, use Twitter to attack my political rivals. I'm going to try and influence the courts. Not breaking the law, so it's okay. And this would be an instance of the president had wide prerogative in the past. And look at what it's opened the door to. Section 168. Who shall be the judge when the power is made of a right use of? The people must appeal to heaven. Again, this use of this phrase, which means they can take up arms. Chapter 15, this is a nice summary of the discussion of powers that we've seen earlier. Paternal power, we saw why that is different from political power. Paternal power is natural, and it applies for children when they're in minority. Political power is derived from consent, and it concerns property and society. Despotical power, comes from forfeiture, and you only come under despotical power when you've done something bad and then you lose in war. Paternal power is short of political power in what it gives you a right to do. Despotical power exceeds it. Political power is kind of the perfect temperature porridge in the middle. Nice little summary there. Of conquest, this is where he discusses, because people say, well, most societies begin in conquest, so what do you have a right to? And he actually explains that the conquering someone actually gives you very few rights. You don't have power over those you conquered with. So, for example, famously, in England, all school children know the date 1066. Because 1066, we have a lot more history than you guys. It's a real pain in the ass. 1066 is when William the Conqueror, well named, came over from France with his people, the Normans. They weren't all called Norman, that was just the name of them, and invaded England. And the king at the time was Harold, and his people were the Saxons, and also included the Angles. I think I've forgotten all my history. Hence the Anglo-Saxons. Anyway, those guys were in England. They fought the Battle of Hastings. That's a place on the southern coast. And Harold gets killed, an arrow to the eye. This is famously represented in something called the Bayeux Tapestry, which is an amazing work of art. And it's got a very long tapestry that portrays all the events from this battle, and it's got Harold getting skewered with an arrow in the eye. Apparently, one of the reasons that that Harold lost was because the Anglo-Saxons did not have stirrups, and stirrups give you a huge advantage in horseback battle. I saw that in one of my kids' educational shows, so I don't know if it's true. Anyway, Harold loses, William wins, and William takes over. All right, and what does that mean? Well, first thing, it doesn't mean that William has power of the king. Let's assume, I don't know, I always thought he already was king of the Normans, but let's say he wasn't and he was just invading to get his own kingdom. So he invades with a group of people. His conquest of England doesn't give him right to rule the Normans who came over with him, because he didn't conquer them. In fact, he relied on them to help him conquer the others. So conquest doesn't give him right to govern those. He says that in section 177. He has despotical power on the other side who fought against him, but not over their wives or children or any of those not engaged in the war. So he doesn't get despotical power there. He only gets power of those who've actually assisted, concurred, or consented to that unjust force that is used against him. Over those, he gets perfectly despotical power. Now, I'm not even sure this would apply to William, because it's not necessarily a just war if you're invading. And actually, an important passage, suppose the king claims property, also having a right to a property of the people he's conquered is their children. How do you resolve this clashing rights, the right of conquest and the right of the children? The conqueror has a title to reparation for damages received, and the children have a title to their father's estate. What must be done in the case? I answer, the fundamental law of nature being that all may, as much as may be, should be preserved. It follows that if there not be enough fully to satisfy both, conquerors' losses and children's maintenance, that he hath and to spare must remit something of his full satisfaction to give way to the pressing and preferable title of those who are in danger to perish without it. In other words, conquerors should leave money for the children of the people they conquer to live on. That's the importance of the law of nature that says humankind to be preserved. Section 186, very important discussion of why coerced consent does not bind. Also see section 176. Direct contrast with Hobbes. Remember Hobbes' discussion of the ransom case. Usurpation, chapter 12, that's sort of invasion from within, where somebody who doesn't have the right of, who wasn't chosen by the people to be their monarch, takes over power. Tyranny. Tyranny is the exercise of power beyond right, which nobody hath right to. So the difference between usurpation and tyranny in section 199. Usurpation is the exercise of power which another hath a right to, the rightful monarch. Tyranny is the exercise of power beyond right. Where a ruler who maybe was legitimately consented to suddenly starts saying, oh, I get to take that property of yours. That's mine now. They're exceeding the power they were given. That's what tyranny is. There's a discussion of whether or not you can kill a tyrant. And he suggests that this is where he considers objection to his thesis. So section 203, a critical question for Locke is, may the commands of a prince be opposed? He says yes, if they're tyrants. The worry then is, and why critics of Locke would say this leads to anarchy. If so, then anyone aggrieved will disobey the prince, leading to chaos. Locke's response says, no, because wrongful acts of resistance are themselves force without right and place the perpetrator in the state of war. And then he gives further parts about whether or not further points about whether or not the person of the prince is sacred by law. His deputies can be forcefully resist. So this is 205 through 208. And he says a few private protests won't bring down the government. Similar points are made in the last chapter of the dissolution of government. First section of this chapter, section 211, distinguish between dissolving government and dissolving society. Remember I said that political systems are founded in two stages. First, individuals come together to form a society. That's stage one. This is not dissolved by a rebellion. If you rebel, what happens is you get rid of the government, which is stage two, and you revert to stage one. So you're not going back to the state of nature. Getting rid of a government doesn't throw you into a state of nature. It just reverts you back to a stage where there is a body politic, like the Leviathan. It just now is majority rule. And if they want to set up representatives again, then they have to come up with a new system. So dissolving the government isn't the same as dissolving society. Now, he says that there are some things that are so calamitous that they can dissolve both of them. Like if, you're invaded by the Hun hordes and everyone is put to the sword. That, of course, would be... But if you dissolve society, you automatically dissolve government as well. But you can dissolve government without dissolving society. Ways in which governments can be dissolved from within. First major way is when legislative is altered. And he gives various ways this can happen in sections 214 onwards. Prince sets up arbitrary will in place of laws. Prince hinders legislative from meeting. So if he dissolves Parliament and says Parliament can't meet, in effect, the people can revolt. They can say, you're altering the legislature, I take back the fiduciary powers from you. Because remember, the people always are like the athlete or the actor, and the government is always like their agent. if the people decide, wait a minute, that wasn't what I signed up for, I fire you as my agent. They can. Provided they're doing it right. If they do it wrong, if they're making the wrong decision, then they could inadvertently be in the wrong. They could be violating the law of nature. So they've got to follow the laws of nature in making this decision. But things whereby for example, a monarch can lose the trust of the people is by altering the legislature, by hindering it from meeting, alters electors or way of electing, presumably by redistricting or something like that, delivering the people into the subjection of foreign power, saying, okay, we're going to be Russians now. We're going to let Vladimir Putin be in charge. That would be a sign when the people should rise up. Or if the executive ceases to put laws into execution. For example, the executive decides, nah, I don't want to enforce that law. Sorry, I don't like it. I didn't, I wanted to veto it. It was a veto-proof majority, but I'm just not going to put it into effect. Then the people can rise up. So that's one way in which the governments can be dissolved from within. Second way is the legislative or prince acts contrary to their trust. This is section 221, by making themselves or individuals masters or arbitrary disposers of the lives, liberty, or fortunes of the people. Now, objections to this. So this is a blueprint for political rebellion. I know it's kind of dry, and by this point you're exhausted, but this is radical stuff. Locke is saying you can overthrow your government. And remember, this is in a time when most people said that governments were installed by God. And Locke is saying, no, you can throw them off. So the objection, section 223. The people are fickle mushheads, essentially. So to lay the foundation of government in the unsteady opinion and uncertain humor of the people is to expose it to certain ruin. This would be incredibly destabilizing. People would be throwing off governments left and right. Response to this, says Locke, is people are naturally conservative. They don't want to rock the boat. I think he's right about that. Objection 2, this hypothesis lays a ferment for frequent rebellion. So the first one was, you don't want to let the people be the judge of this because they're stupid. Second one is, this will cause constant turning over. He responds in various ways in 224 onwards. Any justification for power is a blueprint for rebellion. Hobbes is a blueprint for rebellion because he allows the monarch to be absolute. And what if you get pissed off from that? Your only recourse is rebellion, because what else can you do? 2, people don't make a fuss. It takes a lot to get people riled up enough. And in fact, 226, my doctrine, says Locke, is in fact the best defense against rebellion, because let us examine what rebellion really means. It means rebellare, which means to bring the state of war. Bell is the root of war in Latin, as in bellicose. To bring the state of war back. And who brings the state of war back? Why, it is tyrants. So my doctrine, which is supposed to guard against tyrants, is the best source of getting rid of rebellion. A little dubious there, a little playing with words, but that's his argument. Section 228, again, anti-Hobbes. Peace and stability is not worth any price. His analogy of, in other words, you can imagine Hobbes saying, you can't let the people rebel. This will lead to instability. And Locke is saying, sometimes instability is better than the alternative. Like you can have a stable slave state. It can be mighty stable, but sometimes stability is not worth any price. And that's where he talks about Polyphemus the Cyclops. There's a famous story in the Odysseus where Ulysses, or the Odyssey, where Odysseus or Ulysses, depending on whether you're talking the Latin or the Greek name, it's the same guy, is captured by the Cyclops, and the Cyclops keeps him in his cave, keeps him and his crew in his cave, and is gradually eating them one by one. and they don't want to rock the boat, but until eventually they do, because they're all getting eaten, and Odysseus blinds the Cyclops. So that would be, staying in the cave. You can imagine someone say, don't rock the boat, don't, oppose Polyphemus. Well, you got it eventually, because otherwise you'll all be eaten. William Berkeley, he quotes at length that great advocate of monarchical power. He says even he agrees with my idea that sometimes it's just to go against the ruler. Yeah, it's funny that they included literally every passage in Locke. So in this chapter you get great chunks of Latin, and then he says, and in English. So obviously this is geared at our Latin reading audience. You could compare the Latin to the English. It seems like they could have skipped those sections where it's just giant quotes of William Berkeley in Latin. I won't go into that. 243. Conclusion. 241. Shouldn't the question who shall be judge, we shouldn't take the question who shall be the judge as rhetorical. We should answer, the people are to judge. He mentions appeal to heaven again, and quotes the biblical character of Jephthah, who apparently appealed to heaven. He is also mentioned in section 176. The body of the people should decide. Remember, that's the first stage of government. They get to decide whether their government has gone against them. But if the prince ignores that decision, if you've got the government set against the body of the people, then what do? It's an appeal to heaven again. What does that mean? The people can take up arms and attack the prince, and God decides who's the winner. 243, grand conclusion of the entire thing. The power that every individual gave the society when he entered into it can never revert to the individuals again, so long as the society lasts. So you get rid of the government, you've still got the society. We're not yet in the state of nature, but will always remain in the community, because without this, there can be no community, no commonwealth, which is contrary to the original agreement. The original agreement was to set up the community and the commonwealth, not to set up the government. That comes later, and it's by putting it in trust. So also when the society hath placed the legislative in any assembly men to continue in them and their successors, the legislative can never revert to the people whilst that government lasts, because having provided a legislative with power to continue forever, they have given up their political power to the legislative and cannot resume it. So what this suggests is that it's very serious business to decide when your trust has been violated. So it also means that when you're setting up the government, you should set limits to it. There should be elections, and this is why in the US Constitution, it requires elections every 4 years, because if it doesn't do that, then the government gets to stay in government in perpetuity. So the US Constitution follows Locke's advice, where he says the people should set duration limits on the legislative, and they should expire. Or, of course, the exception is the representatives abuse their power. So in other words, the right to rebellion you don't have the right to rebel just because you get bored of these people being in power. If the government doesn't violate the laws of nature, you are wrong to rebel against them. It's only if they abuse their power or after a set time when you get to elect them again. Any other time, if you go against them, if the people goes against them, they are violating the laws of nature. Phew! Second treatise.